Hello friends, Jennifer Pearson here, doing yet another tag that has been going around. So Kelly at the Truth and Story, and I will leave a link to her video, excuse me, did something different than Katey Flowers. So Katey, and I already did this tag, Katey was looking at, your favorite tarot and oracle decks, or kind of if you could only have 10 decks, only 10 decks. Kelly's tag is more going from one idea of a soul deck, if I understand it correctly, and I will put a link to her video, so go straight to the source. But how I was seeing what she was talking about is that people talk about having one soul deck, or the pursuit of one soul deck, and Kelly was saying, well, I'm not really looking for that. I see myself as a multifaceted person, and so she was thinking in terms of 10 pieces of her soul, decks that represented 10 pieces of her soul. 10, well, I shouldn't say pieces, but I think that's the way she framed it, but 10 aspects of her soul, as opposed to trying to find one deck that represented all of those things. She just showed the different decks that represented them. I'm not sure that what I've done here is quite that, or is in any way... I don't think that any of these decks are what I would call a soul deck. And in fact, there's only one deck that is similar between this and the one I did that was a response to Katey Flowers. The 10 decks I would keep. There's only one. There was one from that video that I ended up removing. So maybe I need 20 decks. But I'm going to say this. I chose these decks based on aspects of who I am that probably are not, a lot of them are not very prominent in my life anymore. I'm 58. And yeah, but they are parts of who I am and or was, and so that's why I chose them, that they reflect that in some manner. Yeah, I don't know how else to say it. But they're not decks that I would necessarily keep to read for other people. If it were or for myself for that matter, in a pinch. And in a sense, I almost think, well, since they are a part of me, I don't need them in deck form. That might be part of the reason that I don't feel that I would need to keep these decks, or that they are particularly precious. Some of them are. One of them, I would say, probably this one and this one. But the others, yeah, if it's a part of me, I'm not sure that I need a deck for it. Although, certainly if it's a part of me, it explains why I got the deck, why I want to keep the deck, why I like the deck, all of those things. So I'll start with the one that's similar, and we'll kind of go from there. So it's the Fairies Oracle, and I would say, particularly like this card, which is the Oakman, that this deck represents kind of animism, the idea of an inspirited world. The idea of an inspirited world. The idea of something beyond what we see in terms of an inspirited world. So it's kind of an animism kind of deck in a sense. And I think it's like, I don't ever expect to meet La Scuna or anything like her. physical reality. But the idea of it as, again, just being an inspirited world. I don't know how else to say it, other than, the term animism, believing that there are nature spirits, that the world is inspirited. And let me see, since I kind of had these in a pile, we're going to go to the fantasy world since we started with the fairies here. So Raven's Wand Oracle. To me, this represents the part of me, I don't know if you'd call it inner child, inner teenager, who really enjoyed heroic fantasy in general. And when I was flipping back through this, thinking about it, mulling it in comparison to some other things, I think another aspect that I see in this deck that is part of me is a certain level of independence, even in this case in odd circumstances, right? There's the love of nature and of animals, definitely in this deck, in fantasy. But again, a lot of the images are of a person who is on her own. There might be other animals, but there often aren't other people. And so I definitely can see that independent aspect. Not with spiders, although I have a lot of spiders on my porch these days. But anyway, not now, thank heavens. Thank heavens for winter. But yeah, so I can definitely see that aspect of myself in this deck. More than one aspect. Like I said, there's the relation to animals, there's the independence, the enjoyment of the outdoors to some extent is in that deck also, the love of heroic fantasy. And then I'm going to do the Universal Celtic Tarot. And this deck has just kind of struck me as being kind of initiatory in a way, having... So it's actually very similar to the Raven's Wand, but it's kind of, to me, a more adult version of it. And so I almost excluded it. It was like, I think my inner child is still quite strong. Because I had the Fairies Oracle, the Raven's Wand, the Celtic, and then I had the Forest of Enchantment Tarot, and so I was trying to, not to mention the Wild Upon Yin, so I had all of these piled in here, and so I was trying to narrow it down, and I still had to keep the things that have kind of this fantasy and relationship to nature, and I think this is kind of where my sense of mysticism comes from, is that relationship to nature in part. Yeah. And that is one of the things I was looking for. As I was doing this. It's like I don't really have decks that represent my sense of the mystic, or doing tarot readings or that kind of thing. And so this is that a little bit more than, say, the Raven's Wand, which to me is much more inner child. This is more an adult sense of mysticism. Okay, let's just go with the next nearest one. This is the Majestic Earth Tarot, and certainly my love of art would be a huge part of this, but the main part of this is my love of nature. And I was once a hiker, somebody who enjoyed getting outdoors and taking pictures and just appreciating the beauty of the outdoors in in mountainous and forested, mostly mountains and forests. But yes, farm fields, yes, all of that stuff. Yep, yep. Extraordinary landscapes. I love extraordinary landscapes. I love, and not so much even as art, but as experience, as in being in them. I have had the very good fortune of being in some really extraordinary, beautiful landscapes. And before, of course, the whole Lyme disease thing, I was more of a hiker, and I wasn't athletic particularly, but sometimes you don't have to walk very far to be in some really incredible places. So yeah, here's the Ace of Trees, and one of the gifts that I've had in my life is a period in which I was weekly going on a horseback ride in and among redwood trees. It's like, so anyway, this is, this does represent a part of my soul. So some of these decks, like I would say this one, and probably this one, and a couple others, are actually decks that I rarely read with, because their appeal to me is a little bit divorced from their readability. And this deck surprised me in terms of how readable it is, but it's not like I would pull it out to do a reading normally. I wouldn't expect it to be clear enough for me. Yeah. So there's that. And that's true of this deck to some extent. This deck, and this deck, and this is a specialty deck. So, and this deck, although when I did a monthly with it, it was more readable than I thought it would be. But so there seems to be a dichotomy between the decks I would keep because of their readability, which is more what the Katey Flowers, what decks would I keep if I were reduced to 10. They had to be readable. They had to serve as decks. That was their purpose, was to serve as a deck to get readings out of and meaning out of. I did not consider that when selecting these. To me, this is just the decks that reflect aspects of myself, which may be why I got them, when they might not be very readable. I'm sure that's why I got this, even though I thought it wouldn't be readable. So, yeah, the Tarot of Physics. The Tarot of Physics. This is my science side. The part of me that liked to consume American Scientific Magazine when I was younger, and read science fiction also, and books about science of all varieties. Again, not so much the physics, but and now I can't even remember all the different science writers that I have read. That was all mostly before the age of 30 that I was deeply into that. But this definitely was, it just tickled me when I saw that it existed, and I had to have it. And it is actually fairly readable, but it's definitely not one that I pull, because it does take, I would say, more, if I'm reading for others, it would take more time than most people want to see. They want you to see, they assume that if you're getting these immediate messages, that's the most valid thing. They want you to read quickly or whatever. But this would take, like, propagation. I don't even know what that means in terms of physics. And then it has origin, and then it's got these waves, and this is supposed to be the Empress, but it says sound waves travel through matter, space, and time. So I would have to figure out a way to make both the physics and the idea of the Empress work together for a message. And yeah, so I don't use it too often for reading, but I'm happy I have it. I am happy I have it. Okay, and then the Sacred Sites Tarot, to me, is the part of me that enjoys research. And that is because that's what I did with this deck. Is I went through all of the different sites of the sacred sites, and I looked them up through video and online, and thoroughly enjoyed that process. And so now even though I've forgotten a lot of these, I just associate that process with this deck. I need to get it out and use it more so that I can retain a little bit of what I learned. But I do remember this is Krakatoa, and I've learned more. Krakatoa comes up every now and then. I think there's a little Krakatoa now. And a baby. I don't know if it's in the same crater or off to the side. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah. It also brought back to me that when I was younger, I would get books about different places. They weren't called sacred sites, but things like the Nazca lines were familiar to me. Anything else in here that I can think of? Not Krakatoa, but I was never terribly fascinated with Egypt. Easter Island. Loch Ness. So some of these are recognizable, and some a little less so. A lot of them a little less so. I don't know if the Taj Mahal was in those kind of books. I don't think Angkor Wat was. I learned about that later. But this just kind of brings a lot of things together for me. Yeah, definitely Machu Picchu. It was supposed to be books on the mysterious places or something like that. Yeah. But anyway. And you'll see in, is it only one more? Kind of two more decks, actually, that one part of my character, in addition to an enjoyment of research that I don't have so much anymore, is that the interest in that global perspective, that the sacred sites is sites all over the world. All over the world. And so I'll go to the next couple that kind of talk about that. So this is the Augenblick, or Augenblick, or I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. And so this is a photographic deck, and that's another reason that I love it, is because I was into photography, and even old photography like this, old photographic images, new photographic images, didn't matter, into photography. But this is like the National Geographic deck. For me, this is my National Geographic part of my personality, is here and to some degree here. Expressed in just images from a lot of different places around the world. In the U.S., I think she got these images from the Library of Congress, but there are places depicted here that certainly are not in the United States. So yeah, that's a part of my soul, both the love of photographic images and of various places, cultures, that whole global interest in humanity in general. And you'd think that I would have had one of my animal decks here, right? But I think it's kind of encompassed in the animal relationships in these decks, particularly this deck. Yeah, so for some reason that didn't seem right to put it here, for whatever reason. Even though, you know, I do the shamanic stuff with the spirit animals and all of that, for some reason it didn't seem... To me, those are really very separate than actual physical animals. So, yeah, I didn't include it. Instead, we get the Art History for Past Lives Tarot. So this is the deck that I say is a specialty deck because it's supposed to be for reading past lives, but it doesn't have to be, because it's selected a lot of different art pieces. Yeah, I mean, you can just get impressions from the art images. So this, to me, is my love of art in general, art across history. There's the whole cultural aspect also going on. But when I pulled this out, I said, well, I should consider this because of all the art that's in it. You know, all different kinds of art. Well, I can't say all different kinds of art. I don't think there's any abstract art in here. But as I was looking through it, you know, I realized that it represents my rather fragile love of humanity, in that it shows a lot of different, I'm not sure I've ended up showing you any, but you just, I don't know, compassion for the human condition. And even though I think I've shown you almost all white people, I know that there are people of color in here. I did show you an Asian image. There's a Native American image. I know that there's images from Africa. But I don't know. Yeah, it definitely, South America. But yeah, it definitely brings out, and I would not have looked for a deck. I wasn't like going in looking for a deck that represents my feelings about humanity. But as I went through this deck, I realized that definitely brings that out. Represents that. So it almost snuck up on me and said, excuse me, remember this aspect of yourself that you don't generally acknowledge. This deck, Tarot of the Southwest Sacred Tribes, is not, as one might think, an attempt to identify with Native Americans. I pulled it out thinking, you know what? There's a quietness about the figures in this deck. It's very, I don't know how to say it, kind of not very dynamic. And I think there is a stillness to my character. Even when I'm not sick, I think that there is a stillness to my character and a quietness and a not being very expressive that I think is represented by this deck, and could be, I think there's a lot of reasons to like this deck. Like, I love the colors in this card, but I think that may be a big part of why I like this deck. So I actually thank Kelly at the Truth and Story, because I ended up looking at these decks differently, for one thing, and being reminded of some aspects of myself that either I take for granted, like this aspect, or tend to overlook, like this aspect. Yeah. Yep, there's just a quietness about this deck that, yeah, I don't know, it speaks to me of an aspect of myself. And you know, this endeavor, YouTube, etc., probably makes it less obvious that I am a quiet person. But most people who know me would know me in real life would recognize that aspect of my character. Very, very much so. And then we've got the trip and wait, kind of the opposite of this, at least in terms of colors. And that is my inner hippie. My inner hippie. I'm not, certainly, again, I'm not as inner hippie as I used to be. But there have been times in my life when I love a tie-dye, that's for sure. I don't wear them. I don't know that I ever wore them, but I love them. That I was called a free spirit. And so maybe this represents that time in my life. I never felt that much like a free spirit. I was on a fool's journey, and by golly, I would do fool things. But I think there was always this aspect that is not really free spirit. Yeah. But I feel like this is, even though I've never been that rainbowy as this deck, I feel like it does represent an aspect of my character. And melt some swords there. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's it. I think that's 10, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There is 10 decks, I'm going to say this, 10 decks that speak to my character. Can be used to represent aspects of my character. It's kind of interesting that some aspects of my character aren't very readable. But there you go. So again, thanks to Kelly at the Truth and Story for prompting us to look at things this way. It was an interesting exercise for sure. It was interesting to me also to see how it differed so much from the decks I would keep as tarot and oracle decks that I consider advisors that I would want to keep. These are different from that. Mostly. Yeah. Of the ones that are here, again, the Fairies Oracle is on the other list. This one I kind of considered for the other list, and this one I considered for the other list, but other things won out over them. Anyway, take care. Hope you enjoyed. I will have a list of these decks down in the description box. Take care. Bye-bye.